it's true, the Vikings bathed.
They bathed. Okay. Hi there, off to battle here, and I'm doing a reaction video for something I deem worthy of my attention. And this is a video about stuff like samurai wear chain move katana, and yeah, whatever. So I just want to say, I'm not an expert. This guy is, and that's what makes his reactions to this crazy article actually worth reacting to. And when he gives his sponsor stuff, I will skip past that.
Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and here I am today back again with a new article to learn a thing or two about history. The
Let's learn
article of
some
choice for
stuff.
today is from cracked.com. I know, before you say anything,
Rock.com.
I know that quite a few of you noble ones have told me in the comments,
Metatron, we are concerned about your mental health, and reading all of these articles is gonna make you explode.
so I know you told me stop, please stop reading these articles. You have tried to stop me, but you failed, so here we are.
We failed, is it?
Alright, the title for today is Brace 5 Scenes from History That Everyone Pictures Incorrectly. So here we are, you see, it's a great chance to learn a thing or two, or three, or four. A thing or five. Let's learn a thing or five. Whether it takes the form of a somewhat historical film like Braveheart, or an only slightly more fictionalized epic like Lord.
Wait a minute. Somewhat historical film like Braveheart? I actually have watched Braveheart. I've also watched Lord of the Rings. I've actually watched these things.
Lord of the Rings, I suppose they're being funny. We do love watching some old-timey combat. Viking, samurai, Roman centurions. There's just something so much cooler about the way men fought back in old days.
Really?
So far so good. Or maybe I found a good one, who knows, let's see. And of course we're about to tell you that almost everything you think about those old wars is completely wrong. In reality, point number 5, real Vikings were a bunch of fussy dandies.
Okay.
If I had to guess before reading, I would imagine it has to do with the cleanliness of the Norse. Quick.
It's like dwarves and their beards.
Imagine a Viking, even if you know your history enough to realize they didn't have horns on their helmets, which would be super inconvenient in battle. I agree, it would be super inconvenient in battle, and the Norse didn't use horn helmets in battle, but apparently there has been some new evidence that suggests that perhaps in some ritualistic context helmets with horns existed.
So I mean ceremonial stuff. There are ceremonial swords, ceremonial maces. If they didn't have crowns, why wouldn't they have helmets with horns on them, just to look cool? Essentially, the sort of headdress. I mean, have you seen some of the Asian stuff that they come up with that it looks like that you got hats like this? So it's the same principle. You have stuff that makes you look taller and more imposing. It's like peacocks.
Yeah, anyways, they're right. Not in battle. You're still imagining a hardened, filthy brute smelling of stale sweat and English corpses. These were the manliest of men, guys who fed on boiled lamb's head. Okay, they're saying all the myth. Vikings were gritty, grimy, poop and chew. Okay. Actually, oh, I hate the way they write the actually. I know they're doing it on purpose, but it's still
Yes, they are.
wrong. Well, yeah, if by poop and crusted barbarians you mean the most dedicated dandies of their time, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't mean that? With their carefully coiffed hair and trimmed beards, history's Vikings would have scoffed at Chris Hemsworth for looking like a Nordic hobo who spent a night in a dumpster. Yeah, so it has to do with the combing. It turns out the only thing Vikings loved more than a fine day pillaging and slaughtering was the sort of personal grooming most of us modern people wouldn't dream of bothering with.
Excuse me? Oh, okay.
Seriously?
Whatever.
Okay. I would imagine the rest of this point is going to be also the fact that they bathed quite a bit.
They bathed. My God. How pagan can they be?
And yeah, that's true. The only thing is that even though they're saying something that is correct, they're of course exaggerating for comedic purposes, but I think one of the problems that I have here is the fact that it's true, the Vikings bathed.
They bathed. Okay. We have established that they bathed.
And they did take care of themselves and groom themselves, but still they are referring to the
Nice shot.
Vikings as the whole population, whereas the Vikings were just the people that went on a Viking. The population is the Norse. I know that many people use Vikings that way, and I suppose it's
Yes, they do.
okay, but then again, they also sort of push this
But I mean, it's Norse mythology. It's not hard to understand if you actually think about it.
idea that all the Vikings did was day pillaging and slaughtering,
Okay, yes, that would be a slight exaggeration. They also had women to do stuff with.
which wasn't. Some Norse were traders.
I mean, their own women in addition to the enemies. So just say that.
Regardless, this isn't the most terrible point, so I kind of want to move to the next one. Let's go. Number
Okay,
4, samurai were actually embarrassed of their what? Say what? Oh, come on, this at least just has to be bullshit. A quick Google image search of samurai returns a gazillion results, 99% of which depict the famed warriors with swords in hand.
well, I don't know about 99%, but yeah.
There are drawings about them using swords, there are photos held pajamas, katanas, and weird hairstyles wear their whole thing.
Somebody's been watching too much Samurai Champloo.
Gosh,
Or
who's
Champloo, or
writing this?
whatever it's supposed to be
Samurai
said.
damn well lived by the sword. What else did they have? Actually, yes, the samurai did have an ancient tradition centered around the weapon. However, it wasn't the sword. Okay, I think I know where this is going. They realized that the sword wasn't the primary weapon for the samurai, which is something that I think all of us in the community of the sword have been saying. But now they are
Is this where I should copy Iron Mouse and say the sword community or something like that?
going all to the other extreme, trying to say they didn't care, they hated it, they were ashamed of it, which they absolutely weren't. But I might be wrong, so let's continue.
Do you realize, you talk about grooming beards for Vikings, how much work you actually have to do to make sure that a really great sword is preserved in its proper pristine state? I mean, these weren't just mass production stamped rifles. Actual handcrafted swords. And you have to take care of them. You don't do that if you don't have pride in them.
In fact, ignore every movie and video game about samurai
Why?
because they only carried swords as awkward, last resort weapons.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, I think. Also, where did he get this effect? This is cool.
To myself. I knew it. Just knew it. We'll check this one out
That's another thing that I'm curious where he got that.
after a brief word from us.
Let me pause this. All right, having skipped the brief word from his sponsor, because that's not my sponsor. You want me to show that you sponsored me. I need the money.
Is that you have someone who clearly doesn't study history, whether it be medieval history, whether
I'm jealous of this. This is just so awesome. I want it. But anyway.
it be Japanese feudal history, and they come about a fact, which is the idea that, yeah, the katana was a backup sword in the sense that the samurai had other primary weapons, such as spears, naginata, bows, lots of weapons that we can discuss in a little bit, and therefore the sword is not his primary weapon. They figure this out, and then they have to add of their own to make it, wow, that's incredible.
Well, that's generally what people do when they history is hard.
Incredible. And so the fact becomes bullshit. It was a backup weapon. It wasn't an awkward last resort weapon. And they definitely weren't ashamed of their swords. This is ridiculous. Oh my god. Cuba no Michi, the way of the
Cuba no Michi, way of the horse and the... Yeah, well, I'd have an easier time if I was showing you the kanji. But whatever.
horse and bow was there centuries before any semblance of Bushido. That doesn't have anything to do with the sword.
That's true. People had Bushido when they were doing Cuba no Michi. Of course they did. The whole idea of military service as opposed to the civil service, as opposed to, the bean counters, essentially. The scribes. People like that. Of course Bushido was a bit different.
It's exactly what it says on the tin. Samurai were all about flinging arrows at peasants from
Lynching, yeah.
horseback. Well, yes, initially samurai were absolutely mounted archers. They still had swords, though. Bows were revered over swords to the extent that many Japanese nobles actually downplayed their swordsmanship. I never heard of that. After all, pointing out how great your sword skills were was basically announcing that you're a terrible archer.
I mean, there's a bit of a point to that, but the thing is, it's not hard to see how if you're professional samurai warriors, you're mounted archers, you also want the capability of taking out a sword and running down a bunch of peasants. Armed, maybe, but what I'm trying to say is that they wouldn't be heavily armored or anything like that. That wouldn't exist in the period that the Cuba no Michi had its golden era. So you would be encountering lots of situations where you have troops that are lightly armored, if any armor at all. And if you see an opportunity to just charge in there, cause lots of chaos, put fear into your enemies, and scatter them to the four winds, why wouldn't you? A sword is good for something like that. See, bow is a very powerful weapon, but it is not a weapon for all circumstances. That's logic.
Well, not necessarily. In fact, samurai, one of the characteristics of Japanese samurai is the fact that they were multitasking all the time. It was basically the fundamental of Samurai 101. It comes with a job. Samurai were good at fighting hand in hand, were good at using swords, bows, spears, they were great at horseback riding. Yes. Samurai were particularly skilled because they were professionals. The introduction of firearms in the 16th century finally killed the samurai supremacy as mounted archers. No, it wasn't gunpowder, oh my god.
See, you can argue that this was the case for knights in the Western world. So this seems like they copy-pasted it into the Japanese context, which is just foolish.
Gosh, but this is worse than I thought. I should have listened to your advice. It's not like samurai were mounted archers all the way up to the 16th century. Already, well before that, samurai warfare had changed. Even 13th and 14th century warfare, because of all the encounters with Mongolian invasion,
Ghost of Tsushima, etc.,
was shifting towards a more of an unmasked yari wielding, so basically spearmen, battalions of soldiers. You still had some mounted archery, but it wasn't the primary thing, and it wasn't gunpowder that changed samurai from mounted archers to foot soldiers mostly.
Yeah, that's certainly not the reason why, but the thing that you have to remember is that remember or learn in the first place, is that as warfare expanded, which was a product of larger populations, a product of the capacity for warfare did increase over time. So you had more professional infantry as well as mounted archers. They weren't all just mounted archers. So the more professional infantry you have, the more that you have different specializations on the battlefield, the more that you have an advantage for having tougher mounted warriors, tougher charges, more powerful shock cavalry.
As they left the battlefield and settled for a new life as bureaucrats and officials, they're formally relieved. Wait, I hope you don't
reviled, by the way, reviled.
Mean that they did that in the 16th century, because that's the Sengoku Jidai. And that's anything but leaving the battlefield and settling down. Their formerly relieved swords started taking on actual importance as elaborate status symbols.
Reviled. Just want to say it again.
Okay, so they're getting confused between the Sengoku Jidai and the Edo period, which...
Yes. The Sengoku Jidai... just watch any stuff about the Siege of Osaka or things like that. It was wild. It was a wild period. And they only settled down after one side won.
Is what happens later, but I suppose this is a little slip, so I won't dwell on it too much. And because bows weren't really an option anymore, the sword became the go-to weapon of the honorable, sword-wielding, Bushido-following, and completely fictional samurai they retroactively invented to feel better about their...
Yeah, if they mean the sword...
Wami.
Okay, what they mean about this is, yes, the only sword wielding samurai didn't really exist during the wartime period. Why would they? Swords.
Desk job.
Swords are fabulous, fabulous weapons against somebody who is not wearing armor. That's the number one way to make swords super effective. So anybody wearing armor, swords are a lot less effective against. Therefore, they were a lot more effective against anybody as long as was in the Edo period. So swords were all that they needed in terms of protecting themselves in their day-to-day business, because they weren't going up against large spearman formations or anything. Well, they wouldn't use a sword against that, preferably anyway. But the point is that swords have a purpose, they have a use, but it wasn't completely fictional that samurai used swords, because that's what they had in the Edo period. The fictional part would be that they used swords while trying to wail on people in armor as their preferential weapon, and that's not true, but it's not the point. Somebody with little to no armor, a sword is very, very effective against. That's why people had them during the Edo period, because they were fantastical weapons against somebody who is in civilian life. If you're being assaulted by 3 thugs with knives and you have a sword, you have a tremendous advantage against them. Is it enough to win on a 3-on-1 fight? Well, that depends upon your training, their ability, the luck, the courage between the two sides, things like that.
This is complete fiction. Bows were still in use well within the age of gunpowder. It's not like, oh, now we have gunmen, so let's remove all of the archers. No.
So the thing about bows versus guns is that guns are a lot easier to train people to use in a massed infantry formation. That's in a formation where accuracy isn't actually all that important. And that's something that was true right up to the American Revolutionary War period, where you had massed formations. And if the other side was also fighting you in mass formations, then you just need to shoot in the general direction of the enemy and generally flat level. That's all you need to do. You don't need to be the marksman because it's massed combat, and the shock value is really important. But the thing is that it just takes time to get archers who are really good at their jobs. And this was something that, again, it's probably cutting and pasting the experience of the Turkish Navy during the late Middle Ages, because they kept losing skilled archers in combat with Western navies. And the more that you had the era of the crossbow and then of gunpowder weapons, the replacement crews could be a lot better than what the Turks could actually push into the field, because it took half a lifetime to get a really good archer. It doesn't take half a lifetime to get a whole bunch of people who can use basic gunpowder weapons. So yes, there is an interest in transitioning to that, but it's basically because it's a lot easier to scale upwards, and it's a lot easier to replace your losses. But if you already have them, if you already have people who are learning the bow anyway because they're professional samurai, you want them to be able to use that on the battlefield. Why wouldn't you? It's just a bonus, icing on the cake.
No, it was for every gunman you need to have a certain number of archer units. Archers weren't completely removed from the armies when gunpowder arrived, it's just that this new type of unit, which was the gunner, became a primary unit.
And also, this is an economic thing. There were Japanese clans that had the amount of trade with the West that they could actually bring in gunpowder weapons into heavy use, and there were ones that couldn't. And the ones that couldn't, either they were just really good, or else they got trampled underfoot. And usually it just took a matter of time until they got trampled. It still happened eventually, but they kept the old ways going for a long time.
Absolutely, but it was still supported by archers. Oh good, the samurai party's over.
Yes, let us rejoice.
What have we got now? Gladiators. Gladiators were basically fat pro wrestlers.
Isn't that sumo? That's sumo. I mean, people have said stuff about that, and sumo wrestlers are awesome athletes. I mean, they're very specialized because the rules of their sport are very strict. It's a very narrow quarter, close. Basically, if you're the better fighter and you're 50 pounds lighter, your butt is being tossed out of that ring. Well, yeah, your butt's being tossed around. Yeah, the 50 pounds matter. So it's not just a matter of how strong you are. It's a matter of how much you can hold your ground, which makes sense.
Who writes these? Turn on Spartacus, Gods of the Arena, or watch Gladiators, and it's easy to get the impression that ancient gladiators were all either lethal bodybuilders or, at the very least, kinda doughy yet vicious Russell Crowe type.
Well, it worked as a movie.
Even read. Of
I've seen
course
that
they
one
were
too.
in decent shape. Fighting to the death was their sole job description. Yeah, I wouldn't say bodybuilders, but Of course they would have been in shape, yes.
Actually,
Well, that's what we used
And I'd like to know how he gets those effects, but honestly, I like my voice, so I don't mind using it.
to think anyway. Archaeologists recently dug up a whole pile of gladiator remains, and it seems that famed warriors of the arena would need to do some serious cardio if they ever wanted to grace the cover of Men's Health magazine. Yes, we are saying it looks like gladiators were total fatties.
Now, to state the obvious, they're skeletons. How do you know? I mean, yes, there are probably some things that can tip you off in certain ways, but yeah, it's maybe on shaky grounds here.
My gosh, can you imagine? Like, first of all, I'd like to seriously have a look at this supposed digging, because of course there is absolutely no link to whatever archaeological finding that they're talking about. Not to mention, I'd like to see how they figured out how the
I see all the cuts that he had because he probably was just beside himself so much that,
the exact percentage of body fat. But regardless, even if it were true that they dug up one grave where a few gladiators were, that doesn't mean that every single gladiator is going to be a mirror image of what you have found in this dig.
there's that too. There were a
Of course,
lot.
gladiators would have been fit. They were
There were a lot of gladiator fights in the Roman Empire. It was an empire that lasted a while. There were a lot of these.
professional fighters. Goodness gracious. I need pasta tonight. What we tend to forget about gladiatorial fighting is that it was ultimately show business.
Not in the way the writer is expressing it.
The Colosseum arena was big-time theatre more than anything else. They did have theatre, by the way. And being
yes.
able to deliver a good show far outweighed sculpted abs. Well, since we're talking about combat, being able to deliver a good show meant that these people needed to be proficient. Can you imagine if all MMA fighters and boxers were completely out of shape? Yeah, you do get the occasional one, but let's say they were all completely out of shape. What kind of a spectacle is that? The Roman crowds wanted to see blood and displays of great fighting skills. Well, yeah, displays of great fighting skills, absolutely. You need to be trained to have great fighting skills. You can't be whatever the heck you said that I'm not going to repeat so I don't get demonetized. Also, again, this idea that, oh, Roman crowds wanted blood.
Yes.
No, not any more than we do when we watch MMA. And
Probably a little more. MMA doesn't have lions.
what really got the crowds going, let's see, was when gladiators sustained bloody, spurty wounds, yet continued to fight. They read like a couple of things, they make their mind a completely wrong way because they have no basis, and then they add of their own. Gladiator schools were well aware of this, which is why they deliberately fattened up their fighters so they could take and dish out showy yet not fatal flesh wounds. Complete fabrication. This is more fantasy than the Lord of the Rings. If the crowd was satisfied and felt they had seen a worthy performance, meaning some bloodshed and gutsy swordplay, the gladiators ran a better chance of becoming super popular instead of dying. In fact, unless you were a prisoner being fed to the lions or something,
You realize that happened a lot. Not necessarily to the lions, okay. That was the Christians. The early Christians. But the point is that it wasn't exactly unknown to come back from a military campaign with a whole big pile of slaves. And you threw them into an arena, had this humongous event for the Roman citizens, and made yourself really popular by giving them a lot of really bloody spectacle. How many of those people were going to survive? I mean, part of the point was you're disposing of people who might go Spartacus on you, unless you dispose of them in the gladiatorial arena. Gladiatorial arenas, Colosseums.
the chance of dying in the arena was only about 10%. Okay, so 10% again is it's a clickable link. I'm gonna click it. Okay, so the link takes me to a book that it's called The Life of the Gladiator. Great, and let's see what it reads. It says, this later evidence indicates that half of all matches ended in the death of one of the gladiators. Those entering the arena in this later period had 1 in 4 likelihood of death. Well, I'll have to look into this book and
Math is hard.
probably study it a bit more, but I'd like to say that whether this book was right or wrong, which should be double checked, 1 in 4 is not 10%. This is maths we're talking about. 1 in 4 is 25%. Basically, this means that fights between professional gladiators were a slightly more
Professional gladiators. not everybody in a gladiatorial fight is a professional in this sense. I know that that stuff existed, but
Extreme version of modern pro wrestling, of scripted fights, choreographed moves, and the occasional deliberate blading to bring on the blood.
only a little bit more of that. You've got to understand something. If an emperor comes back with 10,000 prisoners and sends them to the Colosseum, he's not doing it so that 5,000 of them walk out alive.
Absolutely not. They were actual fights. Yes, it would have been more of a spectacle, but nowhere is there any evidence, whether it be literary, archaeological, sculpture, the material evidence, nothing indicates that they were entirely choreographed. What's the next one? Number 2. How many do we have left? Number 2, cavalry charges were surprisingly ineffective.
Yeah. They watched Braveheart, okay?
We're in the Middle Ages now. Get ready. In medieval times, the cavalry was the equivalent of an army of Navy SEALs. This is the myth part. It's actually true, but whatever. Each driving a tank that is somehow also a Navy SEAL.
I've read of this sort of thing. They read a couple of books when they were kids like me. That's as far as I'll put it.
Devastating battles between two armies were fine and all, but everyone knew shit didn't truly get real until cavalry came in. That's why the very word has come to mean an invincible force that drives the enemy away, and countless films and TV shows still depict horsemen as a game changer, it absolutely was, that can plow through hapless foot soldiers like lines of bowling pins. It's a little exaggerated, but yeah, pretty much. Hell, all the fancy knights and commanders rode on horseback. Surely they wouldn't have done that if the massive hooved hell beasts they are riding would somehow be a disadvantage.
I'll tell you one way they are hard advantage. You're the king. Why should you be walking?
Precisely.
Actually,
A warrior who fought on horseback was truly screwed if the enemy knew what they were doing. In
That's certainly something that's claimed, but
fact, English knights were well aware, I can't pronounce this, well aware, putting this Italian's pronunciation to the limit, were well aware of this and regularly dismounted for battle. The fact that the English dismounted for battle, it was an exception, it was quite rare, and it was a specific tactical choice. It has nothing to do with the idea that being on a horse is somehow a disadvantage. Cavalry is actually
yeah, it's, I mean, I've read of those things too, and the bottom line is that for a major battle, it's basically the one time, and it's not that they only did it the one time, it's that it was a tactic, yes, but they were also greatly outnumbered by the enemy. Why would you want to do a cavalry charge with the equivalent, I mean, let's say it was, total war. You've got 4 units of cavalry. The enemy has 10. Do you really want to go out and charge them head on?
less of a battering ram and more like a sniping tool. Apart from intimidation
Sniping.
tactics and chasing down fleeing enemies, which yeah, of course, these are called light cavalry operations, but you also have heavy cavalry, shock cavalry.
And that's not to be hard on him or anything, I just want you guys to know what he means. Well, what the original writer means. Sniping, because it's a precision.
Cavalry, fleeing enemies, they were best used to exploit the enemy's weaknesses, performing quick run-in, stab, run-back, sniggering, attacks on various gaps in formations and other tactical.
Well, let me just read this for effect. Quick, run in, stab, run back sniggering attacks on various gaps in formation. Maybe if you're using Goblin Wolf Riders in Total War, Warhammer, the sniggering would fit then.
Openings. Well, yeah, of course, I mean, it was used tactical, and sometimes when it wasn't used correctly, even a cavalry charge could be ineffective, absolutely.
In other words, this is the sort of cavalry stuff that had been done since the early Roman Empire. And therefore people know about it. And the people who think that that's the only type of cavalry stuff that actually works, well, not in most of the medieval period.
but that doesn't mean that it was only used to do a little snippet, occasionally run after some people that
Well,
are
no.
fleeing enemies. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But if some confident banner commander decided to try the old cavalry charge against an enemy formation,
What kind? It matters immensely what kind.
he was screwed. Let's see why he was screwed. The second the group of war destriers bore into the enemy, they'd A. lose all momentum. Yes, onto them. Physics tells us
Again, they watched Braveheart.
what
And they didn't use real horses for that for anything. I saw what they showed a bit of the how we made this. It's like you launched a wooden horse on a rail and it just went into the air. You know, movie stuff. Movie stuff. It's a movie.
happens when a body that is running at a certain speed hits another body and comes to an halt. It would be like saying, oh, don't worry about getting run over by a car. It's a car's problem, not yours, because they're going to lose all their momentum. And
Yes, maybe if you are a gigantic boulder instead of a human being, that might work.
B. find themselves completely surrounded by a bunch of pissed off enemies with pikes.
Pikes! Yeah, it matters immensely what kind. Yes, if you charge cavalry directly into the front of a Macedonian phalanx, however you say it, a Swiss formation of heavy pikes, the really long stuff, it's not really that they're surrounded by them. It's that they're facing basically a wall of the stuff and they never get through to the men on the other side. And then, well, it's a pretty bad situation. In other words, it's like attacking a wall of spikes head on, willingly, on a horse. Who does that? Who does that? Except in Total War, where people are stupid.
You know, I know this is not possible, but I'd like to challenge the writer of this article and say, mate, you stand still in the middle of a field. I'm gonna get on top of a horse in full plate armor, little barding for good measure, and I'm gonna come at you. See which one is screwed. Since I'm gonna lose all of my momentum, you don't even need to try and defend yourself, do you? As long as the enemy foot soldiers held together, which they often did because tactics, shockingly, were a thing even back then.
What century are you referring to? See, it matters immensely what kind of formation. Because when we're talking about the 15th and 16th centuries, then yes, the Swiss formations, the Swiss style formations, they were a big thing in battles, of course. It was like bringing back the Greek phalanxes, except better, or the Macedonian ones. And I mean, they were consciously doing this stuff. And if you had the discipline for people to hold together during a cavalry charge, because half the point of cavalry charge is to break formations and to cause panic and to cause people running around like headless chickens, and then you render them headless, it loses half the point. And that's why that people tended to flank or charge behind the formation, you know, at the rear, because they were on horses, they had speed. It's tactics.
Even back then, frigging presentism, arrogant, modern, thinking everyone is below him. People in the past, so stupid.
Like I said, I can imagine I may have read the same book this guy was getting his stuff from. Which is funny because I'm not exactly a top scholar in this field or anything. It's just a book that was available in a high school library. But I bet he read that exact one. Comparing a knight to a modern battle tank. A main battle tank, an MBT.
No cavalry charge was going to end with a trip to trample town. Instead, a mounted warrior would usually have to pull up before the enemy formation and pathetically flail at the enemy soldiers with his, in what world is this guy living in?
One where people willingly charge head-on Swiss pikemen.
Medieval cavalry and heavy chargers were the dominant way of war for centuries in medieval Europe.
But that came to an end, and they were much more hit and miss in the 15th and 16th centuries. Well, what about the 14th? What about the 13th? What about the 12th? What about the 11th? What about the 10th? That's like 500 years. Cavalry were dominant. I mean, they weren't perfect. They weren't invincible, but dominant? It's easy to say, yeah, for the most part, yes.
Plus the fact that he says, as long as the enemy foot soldiers held together, which is, you know, a piece of cake, do it. Do it. You know, stand with your group of your mates. All the hundreds of writers that this website has, do a little chain email. You can call it chain mail. And then you can all, like, I don't know, 30, 40 of you. You can just stand there. And then we're going to have 50 knights in full plate armor charging at you. Piece of cake, right?
10. See them try to hold out against 10.
If people in the past could do it, even if they were so stupid, of course you're gonna pull it off. You just need to stand there and then boom, they're just gonna do it. You know, do it and film it and send it to me. Won't be able to post it though. Too gory. As many a knight found out the hard way, the odds in such a situation are kind of stacked for the guys with lots of spears and their feet firmly on the ground. Number 1, back in ancient Rome it seems, Roman armies didn't look like the movie Gladiator.
Guys, it's a movie. It's a movie.
Standing ovation, please. Although we might be hazy about the exact details of their costumes. We
Okay.
all have a pretty good idea of what Roman soldiers look like. I highly doubt you do. Rome was,
Well, like I said, I'm not the expert. He kind of is.
after all, an advanced civilization with a professional
An advanced civilization. What was the guy's name? Keegan? I'm trying to remember the book. If anybody in the comments has actually read it, go ahead and mention it. I mean, it should be easy to find on Amazon if people have actually read it. I swear, they got this from the one book, and I've read it personally. I read it like 3 times.
army marching in disciplined ranks and against hordes of filthy, disorganized armies. That's how they build their empire, right? Their super cool uniforms, again with uniforms. They didn't have uniforms is a modern thing, merely reflected their status as a
No, I say modern. I mean, that's modern like 1500s or something.
wealthy superpower.
Actually,
If you had a time machine and were dumb
That
enough
was
to use
bad.
it to visit a Roman battlefield, well, I'm not sure it would be a dumb thing to do. I mean, if I had a time machine and I knew that I could come back, I would absolutely visit a Roman battlefield, gather a couple of helmets and Lorica segmentata armors in perfect conditions, then bring them back to the future, sell them to a museum, and become rich. You'd find that only a fraction of the Roman army would remotely resemble what you would probably think of as Roman. No. All of those Roman soldiers would look exactly like the majority of people watching this would expect them to look. To you, however, that's because Imperial Rome's army was basically the ancient world's
Hold on. Imperial Rome only means after Augustus took charge. It wasn't imperial until, well, until Julius Caesar's death, and a fairly rambunctious period afterwards. I mean, haven't you seen the play? Or read it in high school? Some stuff happened. Some people did something.
version of the French Foreign Legion, only they didn't bother with matching uniforms. I think what he's trying to say, just so I don't submit you to more of this, I think what he's trying to say is that not all Roman legionaries would have been a Control-C, Control-V, in the sense that armor would vary. This would be the real thing to say, absolutely. You could have someone with mail, someone with scale, a lot of people with segmented armor.
I'm going to borrow something from Borderlands. Form and function. Something you wear in a military depends not just on what side that you're on, but what you're doing and what your role is on the battlefield. Cavalry aren't going to wear the same armor as the infantry, because the cavalry need to have more flexibility, especially with their hips and everything like that. It's not going to be exactly the same because you're not doing the same things with it. Logic.
armor after a certain period of time. But then yes, the helmets wouldn't all look the same. You could have some bronze or maybe some different types of Gallic. That's true, absolutely. But I think the problem is that he's expecting them all to have a uniform, and they don't. No one ever expected the Romans to be wearing a uniform. Uniforms weren't a thing, and they were wearing armor. It's a different type of situation. Well, anyways, I think that this is enough for
Is it? Is it now?
today. We have read absolutely quite a few things, but interestingly enough, here is something we can see. Jay, so that the person who's writing this article, is working on a book about sex, history, and money. You can message her, you can keep
Money. Look, I know enough about economics to be dangerous. I've translated Spice and Wolf novels. That's how much I understand economics. He must have read that book as a kid. He must have.
it. You can absolutely keep it, mate. But yeah, let me know, number ones, which one of these was your favorite. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching.
Yeah, speaking about Spice, I think he spiced up a lot of this stuff in a very modernist fashion, which an expert like him loves to hate, and why not? Anyway, this has been Off to Battle Reacts, and I just want to say this is a great guy. His content is great. I've enjoyed it off and on over the years, and I know he puts a lot of effort into his stuff, so I'm linking in the description, and by all means, give him some love and attention. And I found his reactions very much worth reacting to. And some articles that are basically, did you know that everything you know is fake? Sometimes they have a bunch of fake in them too. Logic. Take care.